Hi, everybody. Hello, my name is David Levy-Fowler, and I'm very happy to host this webinar on strategies for reducing administrative burden. I'm political scientist, political public policy person, and most of the time when I'm speaking about administrative burden, the issue is related to business, reduction of administrative burden on business, which is very important, right? You don't want unnecessary red tape. And you have all these kind of strategies coming from the United States, from the OECD, World Bank, the EU, all strategies for better regulation. And this is very interesting topic for me nowadays, and therefore I thought it might be useful to do a webinar series on this issue. And the first seminar or webinar is something new, different. It comes from a group for social workers, three of them at the Hebrew University School of Social Welfare, one in the University of Haifa, Noam, that you see up on the right side, and Roni down in the box, and Avishai up there. And they are coming from a different perspective, but still speaking with us, public administration, public policy, political scientists. If you want it formally, the papers that they will present today was published by JPART, Journal of Public Administration and whatever, JPART, and theory in the end. So we have the honor and the pleasure to host you for the first seminar. We had the other seminars, but now we will give them a different and a new framework. And I invite you to present your work to us. Before we will have, later on, we will have a question and answers. So, Avishai, do you want to start? Are you doing
it? I'm going to present, and then on the Q&A we'll open to my colleagues. Hi, everyone. Very good to see you. I'm happy to be here. Thanks, David, for inviting us to present in this webinar. I will share my slideshow, and can you see it?
Yes, excellent.
Okay, great. So I'm Avishai Benish, and I'm excited to present this. Additional to Noam and Roni, my co-authors of this paper, is also John Gall from the Hebrew U. We are all social policy guys. And this presentation is on this paper that Noam just shared in the chat, so you can see the full text. In my presentation, I will try to make the main points, give the contribution, and then we'll open to questions. And actually, I'm dealing with so my other a big interest is the regulation of the welfare state. I've done some work on that, but my second main passion is about take-up. Take-up is a little bit a jargon. Take-up is about people taking their rights, accessing the rights they have in law. And we have long tradition, both in social policy and in law and society, that shows us that there is the gap between the rights that people have and what they actually exercise. And in the recent decade, this issue came up also as a major issue in public administration under the issue of administrative burdens. So it connects well with the work that we are doing for many years now on this issue. As a way of introduction, interestingly, we've seen increased attention about this issue, but the main focus of this literature is on identifying burdens, and our focus in our paper is on reducing them. In this new direction, we developed a typology of burden reduction strategies, and this is what I'm going to present. Just as a brief background, administrative burdens have become a central focus in public administration. Generally speaking, administrative burdens are the costs people face when dealing with the government. Monian and others broke this down into 3 types of costs. Learning costs, think about trying to figure out if you are eligible for a benefit. Compliance costs, all the paperwork and messing with the bureaucracy. We've all been there. And psychological costs, the stress, the stigma, the feeling of loss of autonomy. These are the main categories of the administrative burdens of dealing with bureaucracy. And this literature also highlights that burdens are not neutral. Often they are political in their nature, and the impact both citizenship. Our main interest is on social citizenship, access to social rights, and on policy effectiveness. Our starting point for this project was identifying the gap in the growing administrative burden literature, which usually focuses, as I said, on identifying or measuring administrative burdens, while burden reduction, though, really is there in this literature, but is usually mentioned by pass, sporadically, or dealt indirectly. It is seldom the focus of the research. This is starting to change in the last couple of years, and there's an emerging interest in burden reduction as an issue to research for itself, but it's still limited, and we don't have enough systematic study on this issue. And that was our departure. We wanted to offer some systematic way to study and classify burden reduction strategy, and in the broader aim, more ambitious, is to offer a research agenda of the ways to mitigate administrative burden. So it's all about moving the focus, or having a focus, from understanding what are the problems to trying to figure out what are the ways to deal with the problem of non-take-up. Initially, through a systematic review of the literature, we identified 3 key dimensions that come out from the literature on on administrative burden. The first is the distributive dimension. The question here is, who bears the burden? The second dimension deals with the intensiveness of the burden. This refers to what is the level of the burden. And it's mainly how many steps do you need to go through, and how hard is it to go through them. So it's the number of the hoops you need to jump and the height of the loops that you need to jump. This is the intensiveness dimensions that comes out from the existing literature. The third dimension that we identified in the literature is the relational dimension. This dimension is all about the interaction between the individual and the state. In many ways, burden is a relational concept. It's all about the interaction between the citizen and the state. And we believe that these dimensions help us to understand the different aspects of burden, and also the different aspects of reducing it. In terms of methodology, we relied on the case of the Israeli National Insurance Institute. I refer it to as the NII. The NII is not only Israel's social security institution, It's also Israel's largest bureaucracy. And it is a case in point for our endeavor because in recent years, it has adopted a formal and explicit policy of burden reduction. We have focused on two key areas: the general disability allowance and the unemployment insurance, especially during COVID-19, in which this policy got even accelerated. We interviewed 13 senior NII officials and analyzed high volume of internal documents, reports, protocols, and so on. After identifying all the burden reduction policies and activities, we have systematically analyzed them in order to conceptualize the different types of these strategies. So the findings. So this is eventually based on our analysis, we identified 7 distinct strategies that go along those 3 dimensions of burden reduction. You can see them here. I will get back to them, but now let's dive into each one of them with some illustrated examples from our case study. So the first strategy, which is part of the distributive dimension, is shifting. This strategy is about who carries the burden, and it is about moving the burden from the individual to the state or to other third parties. In the shifting strategy, the requirement is to initiate the claim or gather the information shifts formally to someone other than the claimant. For example, the NII implemented an auto-enrollment system for child benefits. And currently, today, the data we have is that about 95% of child benefits are now paid automatically with no need to apply to the NII. The system uses an algorithm based on birth date transferred from the hospitals, and eligibility is determined automatically with no need for any active action from the claimants, from the beneficiaries. This eliminates the need of the parents to initiate the claim and to turn to the NII in the first place. In this regard, this strategy can be viewed as the gold standard of a burden reduction. We also found other examples in which the burden is shifted, but only partly. For example, in the unemployment insurance, the element of reporting the scope of employment and the salaries was shifted from the unemployed to the employers, who report electronically to the NII, but the other parts are in the duty of the claimant himself. So in this example, we see not a full automatization, but a partial one, a partial shifting of the burden. The second strategy is sharing. This strategy is about helping people to meet the requirements through assistance. In the sharing strategy, the duty remains with the claimant, unlike the shifting, in which the duty is formally shifted to the state or to a third party, but help is actively provided or made more accessible. Let me explain and give you an example. And an interesting example is the guiding hand centers for assisting claimants in preparing their medical files for medical committees that determine disability eligibility. These centers are operated by private companies, but they are funded by the NII, and they are intended to make it easier for the claimants to prepare their documents and even prepare before attending the medical committee. This is something, this is the first example, which is interesting, that this is a state-funded assistant for applying to the NII. The second example is a little bit different, and it is about a law that was passed by the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, in support of and the NII supported this legislation. And this law regulates the maximum fees paid to private sector take-up agents in this disability benefits. So there is a cap. And this is a way of intervening in the market in a regulative way in order to limit the fees and make help more accessible. Therefore, this is interesting because if you look at the literature of administrative burden, usually the agents come from the family, from friends, and other private actors. And here we see both a state-initiated or state-driven helping strategies. The second interesting part here is that we can see that help can be supported both through funding, fiscal tools, and through regulatory tools. And this really, David, connects with our work on the regulatory welfare state that shows that the state can advance social goals both through fiscal tools and regulatory tools. In this example, it's all about advancing access to help. Moving now to the second dimension, the intensiveness dimension, the first strategy that we recognized, identified, is the discarding strategy. This strategy is all about removing requirements altogether, whether it's substantive requirements like asset test, employment test, and so on, or administrative requirements, the need to give some papers, documents, verification, and so on. For example, during COVID-19, the NII suspended the employment test for unemployment insurance recipients. That was implemented in response to the rapid rise of unemployment, which reached the peak to about 25% of the Israeli workforce. But the example is putting out eligibility requirements altogether out. This is the example. Moving forward to the next strategy, the fourth one, is simplifying. This strategy is about making it easier to meet requirements. The simplifying strategy is also focused on actually focused on the learning and compliance costs. The simplifying strategy does not reduce the number of steps. This is the discarding strategy that I just talked about. This strategy is about making each step easier to meet and to navigate. For example, the NII implemented online submission of forms and documents in all sorts of Social Security benefits and services. And this reduced the need for physical attendance at the NII office, for example, through online attendance to unemployment or to medical committees. While it simplifies the process for many, we should remember there's also this caveat, which is relevant to many of the digital tools. For others, it might create problems and even increase, and we put this as one of the limits in our discussion, the digital divide. But as a strategy, this is digitalization that is meant to simplify the application process. The fifth strategy that we recognized is expediting. It focuses on the experience of time, how the process is experienced from the perspective of the claimant in terms of time. It reduces, in this respect, it deals with more the psychological costs of burden by speeding up the process of getting benefits. For example, during COVID-19, the NII implemented advanced payment for unemployment benefits. People got some part of their benefit even before the claim was processed entirely as a presumptive eligibility. And also, administratively, they recruited employees and volunteers to speed up the processing of the claims. Just to give you some idea about it, the rise in COVID-19 was from about 80,000 claimants per month to more than 800,000. So that was a big deal. And the second thing was also developing a corona robot, a kind of a simple algorithm that for quick eligibility determination. This allowed a rapid sorting of the claims, and in the information we got, it was about 10% of the claims were determined by the robot. The sixth strategy is moves to the relational dimension, and it's about communicating. Communicating is about increasing the availability and quality of communication between the state and the claimant in terms of both providing information, one-way communication from the NII to the citizen, to the claimant, and giving and receiving feedback, two-way communication. In terms of information availability, the NII initiated a multi-channel service policy. They extended communication channels to include call centers, text messaging, email, and even chatbots. And in terms of information quality, the NII website was upgraded to expand the amount of information it provides, its clarity, the number of languages used, and also some of the information was designed to be more personalized, for example, by inserting calculators in which you can put your own information to get an estimate on whether you are eligible to a certain benefit and what will be the level of benefit if you are actually eligible. In this respect, it gives a much more concrete and personalized information about your eligibility, which we know in the administrative and take-up literature that can really increase the engagement of people in taking up their rights. And the final strategy, the seventh one that we identified, is respecting. Respecting focuses on the psychological aspects of the interaction with the state, and it's about making interactions more welcoming and respectful and minimizing elements that might be experienced as intrusive or humiliating. For example, the NII reformed the ADL test for elderly care. They removed the elements that were considered demeaning, such as requiring elderly individuals to demonstrate intimate actions in order to determine their disability, and moving to just asking about it and not requiring to demonstrate their disability. This exemplifies that administrative processes can be redesigned to respect individuals' autonomy and worth. I did it really quickly. I hope you are still with me, so bear with me. But now we are coming back to the table. Here you can see the summary of those 3 dimensions and the 7 strategies we've identified. If you look more deeply into them, you can clearly see that these strategies often work together. They are not mutually or not necessarily mutually excluded. On the contrary, it is rare to see just one in action. For example, in the medical committees, we saw that in the reform or in reforms that were initiated, usually they were using a mix of tools like simplifying, communicating, and respecting all at once. So the fact that we are differentiating them doesn't mean that policymakers use only one. Often they come together. When going and try, so let's start with so what is the contribution here? We believe that our typology offers a richer and more accurate language for identifying and classifying burden reduction strategies as part of this need to shift the focus also to reduction. And it matters, just to give you an example, how it's not only gives us language about a burden reduction, but we think that it also gives us more accurate and more nuanced understanding of the existing literature on it. And let me give you some examples. The first example is regarding digitalization. Often in the administrative burden literature, digitalization comes up through many examples, and sometimes digitalization was perceived as a burden reduction strategy for itself. But our analysis suggests that digitalization is actually a tool, not a strategy. It can promote several burden reduction strategies. For example, in the article, we show how digitalization is used for shifting burdens, like in the example of child benefits, or even shifting the burden from the claimant to the employer to submit the salary slips. And digitalization can be used for simplifying. If you can upload your claim to the website with no need to come to the offices of the NII, and it can also be part of the communicating strategy, right? Because if you can get information online, if you get SMS once the claim is processed, or if something is missing and you can upload it, all of those examples are about digitalization, but digitalization serves many different strategies of burden reduction. The second example that we found our typology useful in understanding previous and existing literature was, for example, in the term of simplification. Often, the administrative burden literature talks about simplification, but we found this use of this language very inconsistent and not so accurate. Sometimes simplification comes as a way of talking about discarding, when simplification is by removing requirements. There are examples in the literature when simplification is similar to what we term simplifying. It's about making steps more easier to meet. And sometimes in the literature, simplification is meaning better communication by using simpler language and so on. So we believe that our typology gives us a more accurate language and a better definitions of the different strategies in order to better communicate and talk about a burden reduction. And the last example is gets to the and I think this point is very interesting. One of the surprising findings in the literature of administrative burden was that sometimes governments use more steps in order to reduce a burden, and that often was presented as counterintuitive. For example, giving more information, more notices, and so on. But if you understand the three different dimensions and the three different logics of burden reduction, the redistribution, the intensiveness, and the relational, you can easily understand that it really depends where are we in this toolbox. Usually, more steps will be frowned about when talking about who bears the burden and in the intensiveness. But often, making communication more clear and more clear will take more steps. So it's not so counterintuitive that in some contexts, adding steps will obviously increase burden, but in some contexts, especially in communicating, more steps might decrease burden. Also in the paper, and I'm coming to the end, David, often in the paper, we also discuss how, as in all complex phenomenon, there are differences between the differences between strategies can blur at the boundaries. For example, between shifting, sharing, and so on, and there might be also be some spillovers. And also we stress the limitation of the study as a single case study and so on. We can get back to this in the Q&A. And to conclude, in the big picture, we believe that our research sets the stage for a broader research agenda, which is focused on shifting the focus from identifying and measuring burden to the ways of reducing them. This is important theoretically, and it might lead to various paths of new research that we outline in the paper. We believe it's also important for influencing policy in the direction of reducing burden, not only for business, but reducing burden for citizens. And let me a little bit of a shameless self-promotion. As a step of this in this direction, we are doing now in the Hebrew University. In these days, we are establishing a burden reduction lab that is focused on policy-oriented research for reducing burden at the policy and the street level. I will be happy to elaborate more on the Q&A, and if someone is interested, he or she can also contact me afterwards on that. So thank you so much for your attention, and we, Roni, Noam, and me, will be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Avishai. Maybe I will start with asking Roni and Noam if they want to add something before opening the discussion. So Roni, Noam, what about your...
Roni, do you have something to say, or you want me to start?
Yeah, I wanted to just to emphasize, and I saw that Caesar asked about it. So this Avishai didn't mention it, but it was on the slide, on the last slide. Was not an effective. The aim was not to measure effectiveness of strategies, and we describe various types of efforts to reduce burden, but surely it doesn't mean that these efforts were successful, especially not from the point of view of users. We personally, we had some, we did some studies on how users experience burden in NII programs, but we didn't specifically try to measure or follow how they experience burden reduction. So I think this is one of the next steps we want to take, is to understand how we can take this typology in order to understand or study users' experience in regards reduction of burden.
This is an important point, and we highlight it in the paper. This is not an evaluative paper on the effectiveness of burden reduction. This is the way, and we suggest that this will be one of the ways forwards, research that will try to evaluate different burden reduction strategies. Our goal was just to conceptualize the different types that were used to have a better language on this issue.
But this is also a good question in terms that it is reasonable to assume that users will experience different kind of strategies. For example, if we want to, if we are talking about the distributive dimension, for example, it is completely different. It should be, or we can assume that it will be different experience when someone burden is shared or someone's burden is reduced, for example. So it's a good theoretical, I think, lens to look how these experiences are realized eventually from the point of view of users.
Yeah,
So much,
I'd like to
Noam,
I'd like to take it. Yeah, I'll take it a little bit further. I think that Caesar was spot on the maybe. I think the biggest and interesting.
Can you speak more clearly, please? I don't hear you well. Maybe the others as well. So speak clearly. Open your mouth.
Yeah. So I think that Caesar was spot on. I think that maybe the most interesting aspect of administrative burden is that it is subjective to some extent, and we are speaking about objective measures. So we focused, as Avishai mentioned, on objective measures, and the burden experience is subjective, and there isn't a fine line or a direct line between the two. So we could, let's say, see something like an effort for burden reduction that changes completely how people perceive it and even increase burden, right? Because people are used to something, and then via burden reduction, they experience something completely different, and it can create increasing burden. Another thing that Roni said, and I think is important to highlight, is that the question if specific tools for burden reduction reduce burden for different groups differently, meaning like if we have automation, usually it won't work as good for people who don't have a permanent address. Or if we're using, let's say, feedback or online feedback, for example, online feedback works great, but how about people of old age or a ultra-Orthodox community in Israel that does not do well with online communication? So burden reduction measure can impact people in a different, to a different extent. Another thing that I was thinking about is and this is following up on your comment, David, from the beginning, is that burden reduction measures would be interesting for us to check how they are perceived by people, meaning what is the impact of burden reduction measures on policy feedback, for example, trust in governments and whatnot. I think this is a good next step that we need to undertake, as Avishai briefly mentioned also. And thank you everybody for attending.
Yeah, thank you all of you, three of you. I'm missing Johnny Gal, but we'll try to have him.
Johnny passed his, he couldn't attend today, and
Okay, so let's open the discussion or the opportunity to others to present or to ask question. Anyone else want to come in with a question? Until you overcome your hesitations, dear participants, I will say that where does it, I will ask, where does it come from? Are you really doing organizational behavior, analysis of organizational behavior, or are you following a concrete program of administrative simplification by the Bituach Leumi, the Social Insurance Institute? I'm not asking about the impact, but what's going on with the NII?
David, can you clarify your question? I'm not sure. Did you
So you have a typology of administrative simplifications. This typology is really following the organization program, a concrete formal program of simplification, or just a culmination of organizational behavior. This is what you see when you are looking for.
Now I understand it better. Almost all, and I think all, but just to all are identification of policies and activities was based on formal deeds and activities. Sometimes it was also based on the interviews. So there might be not a formal policy that really states that. But the Israeli NII, as most big bureaucracies and most insurance institutes, is very formal, for good and for worse. In a way, this is also part of the problem, right? Such a big bureaucracy and with a very formal culture is also why there's much more problems of not accessing rights and huge administrative burden. In a way, we really focused on this shift in policy and on identifying the many activities and policies that were put in place. But if you look at it more deeply, you need such an activity in an organization that really suffers from burdens, from barriers, and so on. And coming back, also, when the NII deals with burden reduction, it's mostly informal policies. Part of it were in its goals. Some of the goals of the institutions were revised to insert it. Some of it is in the procedures. Some of it are new initiatives and so on. So mostly it's a formal burden reduction policy. And in a way, that's also the caveat, because sometimes it's hard to also implement the burden reduction policy, right? So we didn't evaluate the effectiveness or how it is implemented. And are at least inches that it's not fully effective. But in terms of theory, it gave, because they were so active and quite innovative in the ways they acted, that gave us a good platform for identifying the different conceptualizing them.
Thank you so much. I see Amnon and Nikolai raising questions, please, and thereafter we'll take more. So let's start with Amnon and then Nikolai, and then we have another 2 questions in the chat. So Amnon, please.
Thank you, Avishai. Thank you, Roni and Noam, for very interesting research on burden reduction. And I have a couple of questions. One is conceptual and one is perhaps about the framework. So one way to understand regulation more generally is that it generates friction. That's the idea. It's not a by-project, it's the idea. So when you define something as why, because you need to check that you transfer money to the right places, that you use your state power to achieve the purpose and not other purposes, that you're proportional, etc., etc. So you have to create certain friction in order to regulate state power. So here, and I like your idea that you provide us with a taxonomy and actually ground this taxonomy. I think it's very helpful. But the connection between this and achieving the purposes behind the burden to begin with. So I'm not saying about the effectiveness. I get it. You're not measuring effectiveness. But for us to think about it as burden a priori, is it burden or is it the thing that is supposed to be regulating the state action to begin with? So this is a question that I think requires, again, it's a friendly amendment. It's just to allow you to shine and to connect it to the notion of regulation. This is the first one. The second issue has to deal with the political economy here. Because, and I think David was kind of referring to this. So we know that there are processes that influence organizations, organizational machinery, and the Israeli Bituach Leumi, the Social Security is perhaps a huge or a classic example to study this. So we have the classic theories that says that bureaucracies self-replicate and they actually enjoy some burden because, it gives them people the way to work, and you don't lose jobs, but you get more. So there are all kinds of explanations about why burden is accumulated, how it is created and grows. So what is the political economy going the other way? And here, maybe and I know this is tangential to your research. But when you exercise the lab, it might be an interesting factor to consider. And also it may be an interesting factor to consider with respect to the relationship between the various tools or strategies that you discover. And that is the emergence of the go-betweeners, the machels, those that people had to pay money to in order to simplify themselves dealing with Israeli Social Security. Because it became so complicated that it made sense for the market to generate alternatives. You come to us and we will simplify it for you. You'll just get what you deserve and forget the headache. So maybe part of this was, this idea of competition. All of a sudden, then I just said, no, I got to do something about it. And then if this is indeed part of the picture, then maybe one should look into how this influenced those six. Does it influence all of them equally? Does it push more to one side or the other when you dig deeper? Thank you. These were my two comments. And again, excellent work. I love it. I think it really advances the research forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Amnon. So you brought several very good points, and we'll try to give some answers briefly. I think that in terms of why did this happen, in terms of political economy, Noam is the right guy to answer that, because we have a paper dedicated for that, asking why this happened, how this change occurred. So Noam, maybe if you can give Noam and Johnny wrote a paper on that. So can you say something about why the NII started surprisingly to be concerned about burden reduction?
I could. In short, there's a lot of reasons why the NII started to really take up of social benefits into consideration. But basically, following your comment, Amnon, everything goes back to whether the origins of burden, as Peters call it, is intended or unintended. When it's unintended, it's very easy to do burden reduction because this is what is needed. But when it's intended, as you mentioned, it's a little bit different. And sometimes the burden reduction measures happen in the NGOs or other alternatives, Macher and such things. But I think that for the paper that we wrote about why the NII started to delve so deeply into take-up, the first reason was basically a coalition of experts, of people who cared about burden reduction, who wrote a lot about the subject, both in academia and both in the state comptroller of Israel. That also wrote a report about that. And also then
under the concept of take-up. So no, it wasn't under the concept of administrative burden, but the meaning was.
We're taking it together for now because I think it's relatively close. And I think for me the most interesting thing was that the companies were just thought that they would profit of people not knowing. Came into the field. That's when the government thought to itself and the NII thought to itself, okay, we need to solve it. It's unreasonable for people to pay so much money of their benefits in order to reduce burden. This is the part when they said, okay, we need to regulate that. So I think that the entrance of these non-state actors really changed the map in Israel. And I think this is one of the biggest reasons why they decided to engage in burden reduction.
So coming back to organizational theory, it was a way to increase legitimacy of the NII in the eyes of the public.
I wish I
would.
Yeah,
and another thing that I should mention is that the NII itself went through a big change of concept. And the vision of Social Security in Israel was changed in 2013 to also include take-up of social benefits, reducing burden, helping the citizens to get what they deserve. So this was a big part that really, if you look at the cogs of the wheels, then it happens also backstage, and front desk workers started to hear more about the burden reduction, and these things also helped the policy to trickle down to the front desk workers. So yeah.
I want to add two things to Noam. First, I think Noam and Johnny wrote this paper a few years ago, and I think our paper a bit make the story a bit more complicated. For example, I will take this again distributive dimension and the sharing strategy. What we found, Avishai mentioned it, is sometimes the state and AI do not only take the responsibility, but they share the responsibility with employers. So in some cases, they can reduce the burden without taking much more burden on themselves. So it's very cost effective for them. And I think when you look about reduction strategies in a more holistic and nuanced way, like we try to do, I think analyzing the political dynamics, or if you want to look at the political dynamics, we should look at different kinds of strategies. So in some strategies, maybe the state or the NII will be more willing to share the burden, reduce the burden, and so on. And when it comes to some strategies which cost a lot of money and so on, you might find different kind of political configurations, for example. And there are also other stakeholders, like Noah mentioned, the lawyers and the employers, like I just said. So it's like you said, there are different stakeholders, and I think this is part of understanding the political movement here.
I'm going to add additional two issues, but
just short.
So I will say it very differently. Yes, sometimes really. So burden is there for a reason, okay, and not only about intentional, not intentional. We try to focus if you want to reduce it, but still you have a complicated systems. What are the ways that you can do without changing? But for example, discarding is also about changing the policy itself. And about the machers, intermediaries in David's jargon, yes, they come into the typology in two ways. First, they are part of typology, right? You use them as part of, as the state-initiated, funded, the second strategy. And the last thing is, yes, part of the way forward is to figure out how these third-party actors play into the administrative burden reduction story. This is one of our following projects on figuring this out. So it's a good question because we're gonna deal with it.
Thank you so much. And Nikolai, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for your very nice presentation. I'm really grateful that I had a chance to learn about your approach. So, David, thank you very much for setting up this webinar. It's really helpful. I think your combination of your analytical framework and the strategy to cope with the administrative burden is brilliant. You know, it's really brilliant. And I definitely will read your paper really carefully. My question is if you already considered to apply your approach to burden on small and middle-sized business. I ask this question because we have a big, intensive discussion in Germany about administrative burden on business. And it's said that business cannot develop its full potential because of the administrative burden. So I just wanted to learn from you what to consider if one wants to apply your approach to administrative burden on business.
Thanks for the compliments and thanks for the question. Very shortly, this is not the area of business is not our interest or our interest, but in a way we would ask you if you find some applicability of the strategies that we've developed to this area, and that might be interesting to exchanges on that and so on. And the second, the way that I connect it is why administrative burden is so much on the agenda, even of the OECD, regarding business, and we don't see the same engagement and excitement in reducing burden for ordinary citizens. And this is the way I want to connect to the business stuff and tell the policymakers, and in a way we are trying to do that and tell the OECD, if you pay so much attention on burden reduction for business, you should give at least the same amount of attention of burden reduction for people taking up their rights. So this is the way I would frame it.
I would say that my new grants from the ERC, from the European Union, the burden reduction is significant. So this is one interaction. But when we speak about the National Security Institute in Israel, we also think about interaction with individual, but also with business, right? Because they are dealing with taxing and also compensating business.
Right.
So it's not that separated.
It's not separated, and I will also, Avishai mentioned our next project. We are trying to understand the role of third parties, and I think it also connects to Nikolai, what you just said, because one of our arguments is that putting burdens on service providers, like disability service providers and so on, might not only put obstacles for these providers, but eventually will also put the burdens on the service users, because these providers sometimes will share the burden with the service users. So it's connecting the two lands, the employers, the providers, and also the citizens in many ways. So it's very complex, but I think, like Avishai said, if you have ideas for applicability, I think it will be very interesting.
Okay.
It's super interesting when you think about welfare businesses also, because then you have burdens on the business and burdens on the people that use the business, and then it creates an interesting structure to look at.
Yeah. Let me say that Amnon Reichman is a professor of law at the University of Haifa, is doing administrative law, if I'm, yeah. and regulation, of course. And Nikolai Dosset is chair of public administration in Germany. And now, Fabian, you should introduce yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, hi, Fabian. I'm also originally from Germany, from Hamburg, but I'm now in Norway at the University of Bergen and also have a PA, public administration focus. And yeah, thanks for the opportunity to attend this webinar. And it's a great paper, and I really see the merit in it for empirical strategy or empirical investigations based on this framework. And I would like to hear more about the burden reduction lab. About maybe we can also do this bilaterally. But related to this particular project, did you gain any insights in how successful the reduction strategies were for the NII as an organization? So what resistances did they meet when they wanted to implement these strategies, maybe both internally and externally? Thanks a lot.
And
Roni, Noam.
yeah, please. Shortly, and because I think we have Roni also with a question, right? But first, an answer to Fabian.
Roni, you want to take that or me?
Go ahead.
So, Fabian, I think that the question is basically what would you look at? What are the outcomes you want to look at, and how successful was the NII in getting there? And I think that if you look at the outcome as processing a lot of new claims, then at least for what happened in COVID, they were ultra successful in new claims of unemployment. But then if you look at the subjective experiences of people, how they perceive the burden, we're not that sure. Because some of them experienced quite a heavy psychological burdens, some of them a lot of compliance burden, because when you lift burden that fast, usually there are a lot of new compliance burden created. So it depends on which side of the equation you're looking at. I would say it was quite successful, but I think that there is a lot of unintended outcomes when you look at burden reduction. And thinking about your comment, I think that in almost every burden reduction measure that we looked at, there was some spillover to other, let's say, burdens related and such. Am I answering your question correctly?
Maybe, Fabian, I think maybe also some pushback on this policy, internal or external. We didn't see much. That doesn't say that there's nothing, and also it might change over time. They have quite relative autonomy in how to process and administer, and this scope of take-up, unlike the policy itself, they have quite an autonomy. Maybe in the long run, there might be some backlash on that, but we do not see it yet. I think that also you mentioned, we don't have good or concrete data or understanding about that.
Thank you. And the last question for today from Roni. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. My name is Roni Reyes. I'm a consultant in public law, public policy, but especially administrative law. I'm originally from Dominican Republic, but I live in the Netherlands now for 10 years, more or less. And my research focuses on accountability or the use of accountability in these tools of better regulation simplification. So my question is around that topic as well. Some of you were asking on the citizen perception on the results of the use of these tools, but I was wondering more on the dimensions that you explained. The third one, I think you called it relational, and I see it's mostly about perception of citizen perception, and maybe this is just a spillover effect of how this perception and this relation between citizens and administration can also have some effect on accountability and also on the compliance side. So that it is not simplified because there are less steps, but it is simplified because people are more willing to comply with the process or comply with the regulation because they trust more what the administration is doing. So I was wondering if you had looked into that or not.
Yes, thank you.
Roni?
Unmute you.
I'm not sure I understood your question. Can you repeat just very shortly the
Yes,
the
of course.
It's about whether this shifting policy increased trust of people in this bureaucracy, right? Am I correct me? And is there another effect of greater trust or better communications, increased trust? We don't have data about it, and we didn't even think about it theoretically, although it totally makes sense and maybe you would expect such an effect. And in a way, as I implied before, that was part of the strategy of the so part of the forces for this policy was a perceived a crisis of trust in the NII, because there was this assumption, and people articulate that I cannot get what I'm entitled for without a lawyer or without a company that assists you and takes in the way 10 to 20% of my money. So in every interaction with the NII, I must take a lawyer. And that created a big, that was conceived as a trust crisis. And in order to increase trust, there was this notion that we should have active policy and also campaigns and so on in order to increase trust. We don't have good data about it, and we don't have a very good conceptualization or theoretization whether and how such a thing should work, although it seems to me very intuitive. So on the part of the organization, there is this big aim, but it's not clear to me how exactly it should work. But just as a way of giving some idea, I think that many people are still not very happy with their interaction with the NII. My anecdotal experience is that many are a little bit more happy, or have also good experiences, and people know that I'm doing that, and they tell me it was much easier than I expected. I was surprised by the clerk proactively connecting me by the phone and so on. But the huge number of interaction, this is the biggest bureaucracy in Israel. It's interesting, and I don't have data, whether this policy created a meaningful change in trust. But I think it was at least an implicit goal of this policy, but we don't have data about it.
David, can I add two,
Yes,
three
please.
comments? Yes. First, I agree with Avishai. I want to add three things. First, we started our journey with studying take-up, and at some point we started looking at administrative burden. There are some differences between take-up or non-take-up and administrative burden. And one of the differences is that when you measure take-up or non-take-up, so you measure how many people, or what is the share of the people who take up or were successfully claiming up the rights. When you measure administrative burden, you also look at people who successfully ended up claiming up the rights, but in their journey and their path, it was very, very stressful, very, very difficult. And I think from the point of view of the NII, I think what was matter for them, it was not only increasing the rate of take-up, but also saying, okay, a lot of people use in the positive way. They take up the right and so, but eventually don't trust us. So we lose in both ways. We also give money. On one hand, we give money, we provide money, we provide benefits, but still citizens are not satisfied from our service. So it was, I think, one of the forces they convince them to make some changes. Okay, so people will anyway, in some level, at least at some level, will use and claim your benefit. Make this journey for them at least successful, less burdensome, and with more trust towards the NAI. So this is one point. Another point I want to add, that's when we ask people, me and Noam, we have some studies on people who receive disability benefits, and some of the responses we receive for it's a qualitative studies, but still when we ask people how was the process, many of them say it was much less burdensome than I was expected to. So a lot of people still have this kind of image of the NAI, and you can find it in Facebook and so on. But in some or in many cases, people say that they found it to be much more easier than they expected it to be eventually. And it depends, as Avishai said, on which benefit you look at. For example, we looked at benefits for parents with disabled children, and many parents were very satisfied from the claiming process. It was quite easy for them, partly because, for example, the NII decided to give benefits based on documentation without forcing them to come and having the child to participate in a medical committee, which can be very shameful and stressful and so on. So this is part of the process. I think people, at least some of them, as Avishai said, see it as a positive and positive direction in terms of their experience with the NAI.
I'd like to thank you all for your participation. I'd like to say thank you so much to the authors of this research. I'd like to invite you to continue to take part in our webinars in general, but also in the webinars series on administrative simplification, better government, agile government, and so on, and to continue this useful interaction between the social sciences and the law, which we see in this group, among those authors, but also in the audience I see. And so thank you all for your participation and keeping
Thank
touch.
you so much, David, for the opportunity for having this webinar and putting us all together. And we'll be happy to keep in touch and to exchange. Our emails are easy to find, and please do engage with us. Thank you.
Have a nice afternoon and see you soon. Bye-bye.